captivating contrast, intriguing scenes, masterful rendering, and a feeling of strangeness. This is the art of gtsleep1200, or also called boyo. Anyways, their unique style and composition are very distinct, and when I came across his artworks I was intrigued. Like, what techniques does the artist use when drawing? Or how do they even come up with something like this? In this video I will try to analyze their style, way of rendering, etc. to then use this interpretation of his art to create my own drawing, which then hopefully will look somewhat similar to his art. Quick disclaimer, this video will be rather long and I probably won't edit it too much, so if you aren't looking for a slow-paced video, I advise you to watch something else. If you are indeed here for a slow video though, then make yourself comfortable. First, let's analyze some of his artworks, because this will probably help us understand his drawing process. The first artwork that we will analyze is this one. What you can immediately notice is that the punch of the image isn't generated by any super saturated color, but instead by this stark contrast between light and dark. This contrast creates a silhouette and allows the viewer to more easily understand what's going on in the painting. Moreover, the characters, rendering and colors remind me of marble statues, something that is the case in many of his paintings. Another thing that enhances the silhouette is that although the characters are rather muted, the values towards the arms do get darker. This way not only does the character stand out against the black background, but also against the bright whitish part of it. My key takeaway from this painting was that you can really sell a painting with just value contrast and don't necessarily need any saturated colors to draw the viewer's attention. This next drawing reminded me more of a practice drawing due to only the arms being rendered, but it works really well as a standalone finished drawing because only the arms are rendered. The way this drawing captures the viewer's attention is through this bright contrast between red and white, which not only is a contrast in color but also value. To really sell the form of the arms, boyo used a bluish or low saturation bounce light, which creates an additional layer of interest because within the arms itself there is a stark contrast between high saturation and low saturation. This comes hand in hand with another way to establish a focal point, which is the level of rendering or detail. Not only is it possible to create a contrast through color and value, but also, as shown in this piece, through the amount of detail and rendering. Here, the arms stand out even more because they are treated very realistically, whereas the face and clothes of the character consist of merely two values, without any occlusion shadows or even the bounce light that is shown on the arms. So once more, gtsleep shows that he really is a master at creating contrast, which is, in my opinion, one of the most amazing things behind his artworks. This next drawing has a lot to unpack, and it is the drawing I like the most amongst all of gtsleep's art. Although the highly saturated blue legs are the main focal point of this drawing, what immediately captured my attention after that is these two white feet. Actually, they show us another way to create contrast, similarly to how in the last drawing one place was rendered and the rest was not, but here everything is rendered aside from these feet. Plus there is a value contrast as well, so the feet really are one of the focal points of this drawing. The main focal point, however, are the two highly saturated blue legs, which immediately capture your attention due to their high saturation. The way the rest of the character looks does reveal a lot about gtsleep's art as well, namely the lack of detail in the character itself, aside from the arms and legs. My own interpretation of this really muted character is that gtsleep didn't want the viewer to focus on the character, but rather their limbs. Therefore, although he did add rendering and some lines to show the perspective and expression of the character, he didn't use any more rendering or lines than would be necessary for that. So, because he doesn't want you to focus on the character, but still wants to establish it, he uses as much detail as is necessary for you to identify it, but as little as possible, so as not to make the character the focal point of the painting. There is also something else that I noticed in this painting, which I like to call Style supplemented by realism. Usually realism is the foundation of a painting, vibe of the image slapped onto it like a filter. But in this artwork there are many places where realistic rendering is only used when it helps to convey the mood or vibe. One example of this would once again be the white feet, which stand out because they are not treated as realistically as the rest of the painting. But a more subtle place where I noticed that is these two legs, more specifically the appearance of a occlusion shadow on one leg and a leg thereof on the other leg. The occlusion shadow on the leg closer to us is shown by the leg darkening towards the intersection with the other leg. However, the other leg doesn't show this same darkening, although it, realistically speaking, should. This deliberate ignoring of realism allows GoToSleep to add a contrast between the legs, because if he did add an occlusion shadow on the other leg, then those two parts would kind of blend together due to their similar value. But now it is much easier to distinguish between these two legs. Of course, this is just a very, very minor detail, but I think it tells us a lot about his art. Namely, the artist GoToSleep knows how to render things realistically, but when a realistic treatment would be detrimental to the whole painting, then he just leaves the realism out of it. The last thing that really enhanced this drawing is the symbolism, namely these eyes which are closed in the light and opened in the shadows. There are many possible interpretations for these symbols, but I think the most important thing is just that they add to the strange vibe of the painting. So now let's summarize what we found out about GoToSleep's compositional choices by noting down only the key points of it. Keep in mind though that for all of this is only my personal interpretation, and GoToSleep himself may have a quite different approach to drawing in reality. So the most important part regarding his compositions is that he uses contrast to establish a focal point. The four main kinds of contrast that he uses are value contrast, which means how light or dark something is. Saturation contrast, which means that the focal point is very highly saturated, whereas the rest is rather muted. Hue contrast, meaning that the hue in the focal point is much different from the rest of the painting. And lastly, level of detail. So the focal point shows much more detail or is rendered more realistically. Maybe not even rendered more realistically, but just rendered differently from the rest of the drawing. Right after contrast, another thing that makes his work stand out is the strangeness of his pieces. Like, almost always when you're looking at a drawing of his, you can't really tell what's going on. And it kinda feels as if these drawings are snapshots from whole stories. But you don't know the story because you only see a drawing, so that's what creates this strangeness, I believe. This next point should be a sub-point of contrast, but it was really important, so I noted it separately. Almost always Boya uses high saturation at the main focal point, and in most cases again, this focal point is either the arms or legs of a character, whereas the rest of the character is rather muted and secondary. Now, since we're done with the compositional analysis, let's have a closer look at his drawings and rendering style. The first thing I noticed regarding how he draws his characters is that he draws them very childlike. There are two things that constitute this impression, which is firstly their childlike proportions. For example, the distance between the tip of the nose and the eyes is rather short when compared to adults. Secondly, the faces are very round. There are no sharp corners or plane changes, as you would see in adult heads like in the Asaro head, but rather every feature kind of flows into each other, and it results in a very roundish and clean shape. So that's what I noticed about his faces. Here is a quick side view to summarize all of that. Also, I thought the way he simplified eyes was rather interesting, so he used a tilted rectangle for pretty much any eye he drew. And I thought that that one was a very neat way to simplify the shape of the eye, so I'll definitely keep that in mind. Next up, let's have a look at some of his rendering. I thought that these hands looked very interesting, so let's focus on them. Something to notice about his brushwork is that the different brushstrokes are still visible and that they generally tend to follow the major form of the hand, thereby enhancing its structure. As for the specific steps taken to render this hand, it looks like he did it like this. In the case of these hands, he started with a brownish underpainting, which is desaturated and a complementary color of the light color. Afterwards adding the highly saturated light color with many different strokes following the form of the hand. And lastly adding a very saturated yellowish brown color to the shadow. This results in a very interesting style of rendering where the light and dark are highly saturated and the color in between is not. And this really helps it stand out as a focal point, I believe. Looking at the drawing and trying to find out how the artist did something is rather tedious, which is why I was so elated when I found out that there were 2 short videos on Instagram where the artist gtsleep showed their drawing process. In this video it's pretty much visible that gtsleep draws on only one layer and refines the sketch by erasing the unnecessary parts and darkening the main line art. The colors are then probably added on the same layer, as it is visible that the artist often draws over their line art using color. The process for this drawing was pretty similar, but here the artist sketches extremely roughly and puts in an underpainting for the whole character, and when putting in the color only slightly deviates from the color of the underpainting, thereby retaining much of the roughness of the initial color and brushstrokes, which allows the painting to look very coherent. Oh, and the brush I used might be the basic round brush, though I'm not too sure about this. Anyways, to summarize his painting approach, he starts by laying down the background in multiple brushstrokes and then puts a sketch on the same layer, decreasing the brush size while getting more detailed. And when blocking in the colors, he sets the brush to a lower opacity so that the underlying background color will kinda shine through, and thereby all of the colors will look much more harmonious. Furthermore, all of this is probably done on one single layer. One important thing to keep in mind though is that the specific details of the artist's rendering approach differ from drawing to drawing, because often they use specific techniques only when it helps enhance the vibe of the painting or if it fits what they are trying to draw. Another point I touched upon earlier is what I called style supplemented by realism, which means realistic rendering is only applied where it fits the painting. If an abstract approach is more suitable, then realism isn't applied at all. So now that we've analyzed gtsleep's compositional choices and rendering style, as well as their general mindset behind it, however it should be noted that all of this is my personal interpretation and the artist himself might say that I'm just bullshitting, but I'm pretty certain that I'm not too far off with my analysis, and to find out if that is the case, let's test it and draw in the style of gtsleep1200. My idea for coming up with an interesting drawing was to base it off something. Like, I'm pretty sure gtsleep doesn't just randomly put in characters in their drawings, but rather has a concept in mind, which they then try to depict as best as possible in the image. For me, I tried using an emotion as a starting point. I won't tell you what emotion it is, because it feels kind of embarrassing to say it, but you can take a guess what feeling I'm describing in this sketch. But basically my idea was for this character to be held back by some thin golden threads while trying to cut them with a golden scissor. So I started by putting in a background color with multiple colors and values to get some kind of texture going on. Then I'm putting in a sketch while slowly refining it the further the drawing progresses. I think the face looks pretty fitting. It does seem similar to gtsleep's art. Also, I like the feeling of strangeness due to the scene with the scissors and composition and all. The rendering here is still pretty rough, but I think it developed in the right direction. Especially when I painted the hand, I liked how it looked. At this point I was 50 minutes to an hour into this drawing, but the thing is I kinda felt lost, like I didn't really feel motivated anymore to continue this drawing. I don't know what it was, but it just didn't really catch me. So I turned off my drawing tablet for the day and went to sleep. The next morning I had an idea. I suddenly wanted to draw a mob from the anime Mob Psycho 100. I'm not sure how I came up with this. Maybe I saw a post on Instagram about this anime or something. Anyways, the more I thought about it, the better of an idea it was. Mob has a very childish and round face that fits Go to Sleep style very well. Also, Mob has many inner conflicts which I could use as the theme of the drawing. So, with this new idea in mind, I got to drawing. After collecting enough references, I once again started by blocking in the background using multiple layers of slightly different colors. Here I'm not using any fancy brush but just the basic round brush like Go to Sleep does. Then I roughly sketch in Mob's pose using this same brush and on the same layer. For the pose I used myself as a reference. I just took a couple photos until I found a pose that looked interesting. Next I refined the sketch and properly put in Mob's expression and details. Using many little brush strokes on a lower opacity, I then block in the colors, which should be similar to the background color in order for them not to stand out too much, because I wanted the hand to be the focal point, so that's where all the contrast should be going on. More specifically, my plan was to make the hand have a really different rendering style. To be specific, it would be completely white and details should be drawn using a pencil-like brush. This would create a focal point that stands out due to two things. Contrast of value, the white hand stands out against Mob's dark school uniform, and contrast of rendering style. The hand is rendered much differently from the rest of the drawing. I should probably explain the theme of this drawing at this point, which is Mob being scared of his own power, which I intended to depict through Mob's terrified expression and by making his hand, which displays some of his powers, look very different from himself, as if it was a completely separate being. And well, I tried to achieve this effect through a contrast of value and rendering between the hand and the rest of Mob's body, which I think worked pretty decently. Then I added some shapes, such as the repeating outline of the hand, some bright red towards his eyes, and experimented with a lot of these strange shapes, because I think they are largely what made Go to Sleep's art have this atmosphere of strangeness. Although this part was pretty hard because it was quite difficult to find shapes that looked weird and strange but not completely out of place. And yeah, after about 3 hours I finished this drawing and this is what it looks like. I'm satisfied with this result. It reminds me of Go to Sleep style, which kinda was the point of this Artstyle study. Though looking at it again, there are some things I could improve upon. For one, my image looks rather flat. Also, I don't feel like it's as intriguing as Go to Sleep's work. Lastly, it generally doesn't feel as impactful as I'd like it to be. On the brighter side though, I do like how the hand really stands out against the rest of the drawing, and I enjoyed this more style-based approach to drawing. Also, I think the lack of impact could be explained by my lack of art fundamentals, which just generally are quite some steps behind Go to Sleep's art skills. In conclusion, there are a lot of things that I learned in this video. Firstly, how to create contrast, be it through value, saturation, details, or style. Secondly, style-based drawing where realism supplements the style is really fun and not inferior to realism-based art at all, although obviously you first have to know the rules of realistic drawing in order to break them. Thirdly, I really liked Go to Sleep style, the style where a lot of brushstrokes are still visible in the final piece or their way of drawing faces and bodies. I just really like all of it and I will definitely implement some of it in my future drawings. So I really learned a lot and I hope you did too. To conclude this video, I would like to thank Go to Sleep for allowing me to make a video on their art. They were really polite when I asked them for permission and even apologized for answering a day later. So if you see this, Go to Sleep, thank you very much. Also, to any viewer that is still watching, please check out the artist's socials. They also take commissions as far as I know, and all of their links are in the video description. I hope this video was somewhat helpful to you, and bye.